Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the United States and around the world to help them figure out how to build trauma-informed workplaces and how to transform their service delivery for nonprofit, governmental, and for-profit organizations, all organizations that are there to help people, into trauma-informed places. In this podcast, we share our insights and our experiences and our knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into actual day-to-day practice.
So today we're going to talk about three intertwined and overlapping concepts: collective trauma, historical trauma, and cultural trauma.
Collective trauma is trauma that happens to large groups of people and that can be transmitted across the generations and across communities. Things like war, genocide, slavery, terrorism, and natural disasters, like a pandemic, can cause collective trauma. And that can also be further defined as historical or ancestral or cultural. That's how these concepts have a lot of overlap. One of the first disasters to really be documented through a trauma-informed lens is recorded in a book titled Everything in Its Path: Destruction of Community in the Buffalo Creek Flood. And it's written by Kai Erikson, who is Eric Erickson's son.
Wow. Um, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit from Kai Erikson, who talks about collective trauma, and he writes that it works its way slowly and insidiously into the awareness of those who suffer from it. So he's really pointing out that it doesn't have the quality of kind of a discrete trauma that, suddenly appears and sort of hits people head on, but instead a collective trauma gathers force slowly and it creeps around people's defenses rather than smashing through them the way, like a car accident or a plane crash or a sudden event does. So it's really different in that way.
Yeah, this is a disaster that occurred in February of 1972. And it happened when a coal company's coal slurry, the dam broke that held it back. It was located in Logan County, West Virginia, and it burst. So, and this had happened 4 days after it had been declared all fine, satisfactory by a federal mine inspector. So the resulting flood unleashed approximately, get this, 132 million gallons of black wastewater. It
Gross.
crested over 30 feet high upon the residents of 16 coal towns that were situated along what's called the Buffalo Creek Hollow. So out of a population of 5,000 people, 125 were killed, over 1,000 were injured, and over 4,000 people were left homeless. 507 houses were completely destroyed, in addition to 44 mobile homes and 30 businesses.
So I think we can really see how clearly this qualifies as a collective trauma, just because of the scale and scope of the destruction and death. And what's interesting is that Erickson writes about, even though this was a collective trauma, what happens to individuals and what they saw in the population of survivors is like a numbness of spirit and uh, being susceptible to anxiety and rage and depression, helplessness, difficulties concentrating, loss of motor skills, so even physically being affected. Um, and heightened apprehension about the physical and social environment. So kind of excessive worry, justified, but intense, worry that it sort of interferes with daily functioning, and a preoccupation with death, uh, people becoming really dependent and not really being able to access their ego functions. So here we see Kai Erikson kind of leaning on his father Eric Erickson's
Yes, building on all that
work,
work,
right?
right?
Yeah.
And then a loss of faith in order, in reliable other people. Remember, this had been certified fine by a recent mine investigator. So all of the morale and moral anchors, all that sense of communality was instantly destroyed, and then insidiously affected people for a long time to come.
Yeah, and I think we're really looking at how it shows up. Like I was just talking about how it shows up in the individuals, but you're talking too about how it shows up in the collective. And I think we can see the same pattern in the more recent collective trauma, which is the pandemic, that we all lived through. And I think about how that experience changed the dynamics of my own family, right? Being disconnected from my extended family during that time, um, my own hypervigilance about contagion. After I unknowingly infected people at a funeral, I was the typhoid Mary of my, oh God, it was, I still haven't recovered from that. But, also thinking about how it changed the shape of my daughter's education and her social experience at a really critical time. And I just sent her off to college, and I can see the effects of that, pandemic academic environment on her and the whole cohort of freshmen that she's moved in with. Um, and collectively, I also think about how the pandemic influenced the politicization of science and the long lasting repercussions that's had politically on our communities.
Yeah, and that's really so important because we've barely begun to address the consequences of the pandemic, especially the impact on our crippled healthcare and mental health care systems that actually had been being degraded for decades before the pandemic hit, and now are clearly in crisis, largely because confronting the problems means having to confront basic problems in our economic and political systems that we can barely talk about, and we can't even have cross conversations about. The whole country is so split and divided.
I really appreciate your comment about like how we can't even talk about it. And Thomas Hubel, in his book Healing Collective Trauma, he talks about the fact that every region has its own distinct trauma signature. So how the impact of trauma manifests and shows up in different communities is going to look different in different places. But one of the commonalities is, in his words, that it's as if a massive elephant sits in the human living room. Few may see or acknowledge it, but we are all impacted by its presence. And everything about our societies, from geopolitics to business, climate, technology, healthcare, even entertainment and celebrity, is dominated by the existence of this elephant, by the residue of our collective trauma. And as long as we fail to acknowledge or adequately care for it, that elephant will grow larger.
Exactly. And much of what we know about trauma now, today, originally derives from the study of Holocaust survivors and the generations that followed. One of the writers, Helen Epstein, wrote about the children of the Holocaust. And she described how collective trauma is this cataclysmic event that basically shatters the basic fabric of society that we don't even usually think about. It just is what we take for granted. And aside from the horrific loss of life, collective trauma is also a real crisis of meaning. And it begins with a collective trauma that then is transformed into a collective memory and culminates in a system of meaning that actually allows groups to redefine who they are and where they are going. And that gets continued to being played out.
So just spent a little time talking about collective trauma. Let's talk also about historical trauma. And Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, who's a Lakota professor of social work, has really, I think, done a great job of defining historical trauma. And she says it's the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations. So, historical trauma is really multi generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. And it's related to major events of oppression that, impact a particular group of people because of their status assigned by the oppressors. So, the examples I think that come to mind are slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. And it's interesting because some people in those groups don't experience the effects directly of historical trauma, where others experience problems with their physical and behavioral health, low self esteem, depression, self destructive behavior, violence, aggression, substance misuse and addiction, high rates of suicide and cardiovascular disease, like a lot of the things that we see in tribal communities on reservations as a result of this historical trauma.
Yeah, acute problems of domestic violence or alcohol abuse that are not directly linked to historical trauma may be exacerbated by living in a community that actually has all the time unaddressed grief and behavioral health needs. And parents' experience of trauma may disrupt typical good parenting skills and contribute to behavior problems in children. And compounding this familial or intergenerational trauma, historical trauma often involves the additional challenge of a damaged cultural identity. Clinical social workers first described historical trauma among descendants of the Holocaust and among the children of Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm kind of like thinking about zooming in and zooming out, zooming in and zooming out, and it's like micro and macro impact. So when you were talking about parenting being disrupted, we see that through the disruption of attachment because of the exposure to trauma in parents, and then that attachment pattern then impacts how those children then parent as generations go on. So it's sort of that direct line, but then also thinking about the issues around identity as being so important, like the disconnection from your larger group cultural identity. And Dr. Braveheart actually talks a lot about that unresolved grief through the experiences of, particularly for indigenous people, repeated massacres, forced removal of children into residential schools. And even this all was like so powerful when I was reading about this, that she was talking about the unsettled bereavement that resulted from the prohibition or interruption of their indigenous burial practices and ceremonies. So even being able to grieve their dead in a way that was symbolic and sacred, when that disappeared, it also, created another layer of disconnection, not just for the individuals, but for the whole community.
Now, the third concept, and again, remember, they're all interrelated. They just, different people have focused on these concepts at different times. So cultural trauma, culture is a grouping of elements, and we talk about values, norms, outlooks, beliefs, ideologies, knowledge, and empirical assertions that are linked with one another as a meaning system. That's a definition of what a culture is. A cultural trauma refers to an invasive and overwhelming event that is believed to undermine or overwhelm one or several essential ingredients of a culture or the culture as a whole. And there are examples throughout history. So just if we just look at one, the Protestant Reformation was really a cultural trauma in its day because of the fundamental threat it posed to the integrity and dominance of the Catholic cultural worldview at the time. And we can see those elements continue to permeate through our culture, even hundreds of years later. Or the imposition of Western values on colonial societies in the 19th and 20th century. A gazillion examples of that. The exposure of migrating groups to the cultures of the host societies into which they migrate provides still more examples of a cultural trauma. So it occurs when members of a collectivity feel that they have been subjected to some horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in some fundamental and irrevocable ways.
Yeah, it's really different from a psychological or physical trauma for an individual, right? That kind of experience creates enormous emotional distress and anguish for the person. But cultural trauma, it's really about the loss of collective identity. And I think, the way that makes, the biggest impact in my mind in that definition is it's a trauma to the social fabric. It's not a trauma to the person, it's a trauma to the connections between the people.
And when this happens, particularly if there is an identifiable enemy, not a natural disaster, then what arises is the innate desire for revenge. And that can completely overtake rational thought. Many people who are listening today can recall the events of 9/11, 2001. I was in Florida, in Tampa, giving a talk to several hundred people. And, I can usually hold people's attention for a while, but within minutes, and I'd started talking about traumatic stress, I watched people moving to the back of the room and getting on their cell phones. And then finally, because we did have cell phones then, but not everybody did. So people would follow after somebody that did. And then finally, somebody came up to the room and called off the seminar after telling us all what had happened. And all I wanted to do was get back home. Where were you? Where were you when you heard the news?
I actually was living in New York City at that time, and I was on my way to work. I was driving north on the Henry Hudson, for any New Yorkers out there who will know what that is. And I got out of the city right before they shut down all the bridges and tunnels. So for me, my experience was manifested in like the profound disconnection. Like I got closed out. I got locked out of the city. I couldn't get back home. Um, and so I went to work and tried to do my day, but at the end of the day, I didn't have anywhere to go. So I got in my car and I drove to my parents' house. I drove to my childhood home, and I just remember my parents met me in the driveway. I got out of my car, they came out in the driveway, and I literally just sat in the middle of my parents' driveway and cried. And both my mom and dad sat down with me, and that was And I remember that so profoundly because my sense of safety about my home, my city, it was cracked. There were real cracks in my identity as a New Yorker.
9/11 is a really good illustration for how collective trauma can mobilize whole countries and sometimes in very destructive ways. At first, it looked like maybe we would give ourselves time for the experience of collective mourning and thoughtful discourse about what it all meant and why and what we should do. But despite all intelligence information from the US intelligence community and the intelligence community in the UK and in Jordan and Saudi Arabia and others, our president at the time was sure that Saddam Hussein from Iraq was behind the attack. And he led the American people to believe it as well. So we attacked Iraq with enormous continuing negative consequences. But even though accurate information later came out, even 2 years later, a poll showed that 69% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein was personally involved in the 9/11 attack, which he wasn't. And even more staggering was that 82% believed that he had provided assistance to Osama bin Laden, who was responsible. But both of those notions were utterly false.
Yeah, this is so personal to me because my wife was in the army at that time, and she served in Iraq. And her, she risked her life and lost colleagues in that war. And to be able to look back and see from this perspective what happened, it's really um, infuriating and enraging, and also it makes a lot of sense when we understand trauma responses and the desire for revenge.
And how whole countries can be overtaken by emotion.
Right, at how this is a collective cultural trauma.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
so when we think about defining a cultural trauma, it really kind of has to meet three criteria. It must be remembered or made to be remembered. It must be made culturally relevant. That means it's represented as really damaging or obliterating to something sacred. And the memory must be associated with really strong negative affect, usually disgust, shame, or guilt. And as we were just talking about 9/11 and then uh, the the invasion of Iraq afterwards, I feel like it hits these three criteria pretty clearly.
Oh, clearly. And if you look at the sweep of American history, the memory of the institution of slavery appears to qualify most unequivocally as a cultural trauma because it comes close to meeting those three conditions. So does the seizure of Native American lands and the partial extermination of their populations.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that qualify as a trauma at one moment in a society's history, but maybe not in another. Um, we can think about some social dislocations and catastrophes as cultural traumas if they massively disrupt organized social life. So things like disease, famine, and war can be identified as historical cultural traumas. The Great Depression can also be regarded as a cultural trauma because it ripped the social fabric, the economic institutions of our societies.
Another important concept related to collective trauma is collective denial. And that happens when whole groups of people and even whole countries deny the reality of other people's suffering that they've caused. So, for instance, after 20 years of a US funded war in Afghanistan, it's pretty certain that it wasn't only bad people who have been injured or killed, but we'd rather forget about it all and just kind of move on.
Yeah, this refusal of to take responsibility means forgetting. It's historical amnesia, and it's what we do here in the United States. There's this intense need for belief in national goodness and innocence, and that distorts our memories.
And all of this leads to wars. Cultural traumas manifest this tendency towards political polarization and sharply divided debates. All of the elements necessary for this have by now been mentioned: a threatening, if not overwhelming, assault on cultural integrity, and an event or situation that is endowed with powerful but often very ambivalent feelings. And this combination produces an effect that we as professionals call splitting, whereby one side of the ambivalence is more or less completely denied, negated, or repressed, and the other side made to be the whole story. So political polarization results when two or more political groups, each having adopted rigid, opposing modes of splitting, confront one another and have at it, either in struggles over the meaning or the assessment of the trauma. And it really does lead often to war.
And it also, I think, represents so clearly the opposite of what recovery is, right? We talk so much about recovery from trauma is about integration. And what we're doing over and over and over again is recreating the splitting, disconnecting from even the ability to integrate by constantly recreating the trauma through our own conflict. Wow. Okay. Good stuff, Sandy. That was, this is so intense, but here's some good news, right? There are ways to reverse those impacts, and in creating presence, we've got some really good ideas about how to do that. So thanks for listening to Creating Presence. And coming up after the break, we'll talk about the importance of restoring memory and justice as a way to reverse those negative impacts of collective historical and cultural trauma.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And today we're focusing on collective, historical, and cultural trauma. We're going to continue our discussion and turn our focus to what might be helpful in our families, our workplaces, and our communities, and our whole country in light of our many centuries of exposure to these three types of trauma.
So let's start with a family example, because one of the big problems for humanity is that although the knowledge about collective experience of trauma might be consciously forgotten about, the impact remains, because the transgenerational transmission, the ways that individuals, families, and cultures change their norms as a result of the traumatic events, then get passed down to the next generations without them ever knowing why, without being able to make sense of it, but still feeling those associated feelings. And Sandy, you've done some reading from a psychiatrist and psychohistorian. Will you say a little bit about what you've read? And
his name is Vamek Volkan, and he wrote, transgenerational transmission is when an older person unconsciously externalizes his traumatized self onto a developing child's personality. A child then becomes a reservoir for the unwanted, troublesome parts of an older generation. And I'll share with you how I first learned about the reality of that. I was many years ago, when I was still in practice, I learned about this from a patient. He's a highly educated man. He came to me because he was just plagued by an unrelenting sense of guilt and shame And what puzzled him is that there wasn't any reason related to his own life. His parents had been terrific. It wasn't that he just couldn't make any sense out of it. And he was really puzzled. And I couldn't either. I didn't know what the problem was, but I asked him about his family history, and he really knew nothing. His parents had moved to the East, but the family, the more extended family, was actually from the Midwest, and they had no contact with them. So he thought they were all dead. So he didn't really know much. Remember, this was at a time where there was no internet available. So he couldn't look anything up. So he decided to go and explore, and he traveled to where his grandparents and other family were from. What he discovered was that there had been a murder-suicide in his grandparents' generation that had been the source of such exposure in the press and shame for the entire family that they had moved away from each other.
Mm.
And it was really powerful because he did this whole journey of reconstructing the past. And that's what relieved his symptoms. It wasn't me.
Wow.
And he was all better. Wasn't suffering from that anymore. But of course, it made me think about my own family. And I started to wonder, why in the world was I always interested in psychology? Why did I want to become a psychiatrist? I mean, that goes way back. I started working in mental health when I was a teenager. Why? I had nobody in my family who had any connection with any kind of mental health service. It just was not even on the radar. And when I was in midlife, I was in my 40s, sitting at dinner at my house with my parents. My father says, "Oh, yeah, there was Uncle Elwood. Yeah, he killed his wife and killed himself." And I went, "What?"
Oh my gosh.
I knew nothing about that. It was my dad's uncle. And I went, "Oh, well, maybe that's why I was so interested in how and I didn't even know that."
Well, it strikes me that there are so many TV shows now and podcasts around genealogy and people actually doing that deep dive. And, the culmination of all of these episodes is always like someone having that light bulb go off where like they discover that someone generations back had this experience or did this thing, or there was some representation that really connects with their own lived experience. And just the relief of being able to make sense of these things that don't make sense. And we see that a lot in our organizations, right? Because in creating presence, we know that the past influences the present. And just like you were describing with the child becomes the reservoir for the older generations. The current staff members in an organization are the reservoir in the same way of all of the trauma that's happened in an organization before. So what I have found is, one, being able to learn and tell the history of the organization, being able to have some context for the trauma history and how it might be influencing current practice, really important and part of what we do in our practice and implementation. But it makes me think about one of the other things that's been so important, and that is about really thinking about justice, right? So much of collective historical and cultural trauma is about oppression, which is inherently about injustice. The antidote, in many ways, is focusing on justice. And, in work environments, we know that when people experience injustice, they don't usually keep that to themselves. When they don't feel like they're being treated fairly, they talk to their peers, they seek social support. And in the process, the individual views of justice are combined, and it creates this collective view of what justice is. And we talk about that as the organizational justice climate. What's fair, what's not fair. It's a way that people have of making sense of their reality and their perceptions.
Yeah, feelings about organizational justice are incredibly contagious, and they're communicated like instantaneously from one individual to another and then maintained across groups. So just hearing about somebody else's experience can color the subsequent viewpoints of the listener, no matter what's happened to them. People tend especially to rely on other people in situations that are ambiguous, and evaluations of what is fair and not fair in an organizational context are often ambiguous and very open to interpretations.
And because of that ambiguity, I think in creating presence, we need to get really specific and we need to, talk directly about the impact of justice and the perspectives or perceptions and experiences of justice within the organization. And so research has demonstrated that there are three kinds of justice that need to be addressed in the workplace. And they're all aspects of overall fairness, but they tend to interact with each other. And the three kinds of justice are distributive, procedural, and interactional.
Distributive justice is really how resources are allocated and what some people get and others don't. Employees regularly, we've all done this. We do a sort of internal calculus, balancing what we put into the job and what we expect to get out of it. And we feel justly treated when those inputs and outputs are balanced. And we feel unjustly treated if we work harder than we are rewarded for. And this can lead to some very bad outcomes. That's when people will sabotage, will steal things as people try to even the score on their own terms. On the other hand, we are likely to feel guilty when we are rewarded more than we feel we've earned, and we may overwork in order to establish a more acceptable equilibrium. And when what we receive is equitable, we are rewarded based on our individual contribution, and this tends to reward high performance. When it's equal, we're all treated alike, and this tends to build esprit de corps among teammates.
So, in coaching our organizations, when I recognize that there's a lot of conversation about fairness happening within the organization, that little, light flashes in my head. I'm like, oh, okay, we need to think about distributive justice. And so part of the work that I do is to talk with the leadership about some of the intentions versus perceptions, or intentions versus, how things are received or experienced. So we have very, intense conversations about things like parking, office space, workload, right? We are looking at the policies that are created and designed in their organizations to really pull apart, like, what's the intention around this, the way that things are. And sometimes they're not overt policies, but they're norms. They're just kind of the way things have evolved. And yet there's a lot of meaning and messaging in those. And so that's kind of the direct work that we do around distributive justice in creating presence. But we also then have a lot of conversations about fairness. Like, fairness doesn't necessarily mean everyone gets the same. It really, we fall back a lot on recognizing that fairness is about getting what you need to be successful, and then trying to align those policies with that philosophy.
The second kind of justice that we focus on is procedural justice. And that refers to the means by which rewards and punishment are doled out. Right? This form of justice establishes principles that govern how decisions are made. A just process is one that is applied consistently to everybody, that's free of bias, it's accurate, and it's an accurate representation of all relevant stakeholders. It's correctable and it's consistent with ethical norms. So when employees believe that a process is fair, they tend to trust their leaders more and are more committed to the organization. Procedural injustice, on the other hand, really creates enormous distrust and resentment. If procedures are believed to be fair, even if the outcome is unfavorable, the employee is more likely to remain loyal and behave in the interest of the organization. So in a study of over 1,000 employees, a major determinant of whether an employee sued his employer for wrongful termination was their perception of how fairly the termination process was carried out. Only 1% of ex-employees who felt that they were treated with a high degree of procedural fairness filed a wrongful termination lawsuit versus 17%, so 17 times more likely, of those who believe they were treated with a low degree of procedural fairness filed a wrongful termination lawsuit. So it has a lot of implications.
Yeah, it also makes me think about how issues around procedural justice in our organizations are influenced by cultural and historical trauma. Particularly when I think about, how those historical traumas of slavery and uh, colonization have influenced our current incarceration and policing, and how the wider, broader system in our country around policing and incarceration and profiling influences how people are treated within our organizations around procedural justice. So this is a big one for us in creating presence. And a lot of my time in coaching is around helping people in leadership and even in HR departments think about their performance evaluation process, right? Because that dictates how people are evaluated and whether they get promoted or whether they are demoted or potentially fired. And that means looking at things like their dress codes, right? There's a lot of talking about hairstyles and um, cultural expressions in people's clothing. Those are some of the things that we really need to look at closely when we're talking about procedural justice. We also look at job descriptions, incident response protocols, incentive systems. So all of these procedural processes and policies, they all give messages about what's important, what's valued. And in doing that, they give messages about who is valued and who is important. So we talk too about, changing language in policies from punitive or rules-based to restorative or relational language. That becomes part of our implementation of trauma-informed practice. We talk about how people are educated about expectations. Who makes those decisions? Do those people who are making the decisions have any understanding about trauma symptoms and the expression of those symptoms through behavior? um, what is the process for communicating not just with people around procedural or disciplinary issues, but also bystanders? How do we think about, what happens to the people who are observing an injustice? Because all of that has important messages too.
I remember when you bring up dress codes, I remember our former pal Brian
Yeah, the
uh,
shoe.
talking about an incident that occurred with at the place where he was working and you were working
Yeah.
around shoes, right? Around Well,
Yeah.
what was, what, somebody had
Open-toed shoes.
open-toed shoes because somebody had gotten hurt, right? With
Yes.
open-toed shoes
Yeah.
on the line staff. And then
Mhm.
the administrator decided, all men,
Mhm.
decided to ban open-toed shoes, and there was a revolt. Because
Chaos ensued. Yeah.
that's all the social workers and the clinicians in the summer had was
Right.
open-toed shoes. They weren't
Right.
going to increase the salary for
Right. To
people to
go
go
buy
get
new
new
shoes.
shoes.
Right.
And that, I mean, that was a real tangible
Yeah.
experience of this kind of injustice, and it was corrected.
Yes.
He did fix it. And then there's interactional justice. This refers to how one person treats another person. If he or she or they appropriately share information, also called informational justice, and treats the other with respect and dignity, interpersonal justice. But because these three forms of justice interact and influence each other, one component can be low, but if employees perceive that the other two are present, then the negative impact can really be offset.
Yeah, I think in my coaching experience, the issues around interactional justice are really interesting and they're so different from place to place. But one of the things that I see that comes up frequently is around that informational justice, right? And gatekeeping and people using a need to know philosophy with sharing information and kind of holding information as power. um I'm thinking specifically about like the most intense example of gatekeeping that I've ever encountered, which was a CEO that I worked with who hired two administrative assistants and put both of their desks right outside of his door. And it was like the most physical expression of gatekeeping I've ever seen. You literally had to go through two women and like squeeze between their two desks to get into his door. Like he was so off limits. It was bananas. Um, so it was like really clear that he was separate, and that that the way that people experienced that was through fear, right? It was like, he was untouchable. And so there were a lot of power abuses that happened because of that untouchability. And so in creating presence, we really think a lot about who has access to other people and to information. But we also, even when we're not thinking specifically about like the organizational structure around authority, formal authority, meaning titles and such. But we also think about interactional justice around peers, coworkers, colleagues. And so, one of the things that I encourage, and it seems so simple, but it's so powerful when we do it, is literally asking people to talk to their colleagues about what makes them feel respected, what makes them feel disrespected, and what are the best ways to demonstrate respect in an individualized way to each person. And having that conversation really changes things because now, once you know, you can be more aligned with what someone needs. And most people are willing to do that and want to do that because it creates better relationships and a better quality of life in your workplace.
Our Brian Farraher and our friend, he's my co-author for Destroying Sanctuary. He encountered dilemmas a lot about organizational justice in his managerial role, mainly because he was willing to confront them. and and he wrote, in a stressed organization, it seems to me that justice is elusive. That's a really important point. That even if a manager wants to behave justly, it's likely, given the conditions, that he or she will not always be consistent, timely, neat, and clean across the board. A simple misstep is easily interpreted by somebody as unjust. And additionally, not everyone knows the whole story. So this is just an ongoing issue in organizations.
Yeah, and I think he's talking so much about how we're humans, all of us. But when we're in leadership roles, often people expect us to be superhuman and to not make those mistakes or missteps. And he also said, sometimes a process might be viewed by the staff involved as unfair because they think the situation is unique. It's unique to them because they're the ones who are experiencing it. And their impressions of what happened might be shared with the organization. But then the problem is that the manager or the leader isn't able to give that other side of the story. And so as a result, it sort of becomes the lived truth, because, for personnel issues, justice is in the eye of the beholder.
Right, right,
And people who are in positions of holding confidentiality don't get to be the beholders.
right. And what he's really talking about is the connections between justice, trust, and emotions, right? So maintaining a just environment has been shown to profoundly affect organizational function. Justice builds trust and commitment. All three components of distributive, procedural, and interactional justice predict trust, and trust predicts organizational commitment. So, therefore, workplace justice has been shown to predict how effective people are at doing their jobs. There are indications that the emotional response to injustice is what is aroused first, which we can all relate to that. That's what happens. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, you're not thinking about why they did it, you're just angry. Um, and then it's followed by thinking about by cognitions and interpretations that precipitated the emotions. But that's when retaliatory behaviors may follow closely on heels of this very complex but wholly human responses. So the response to injustice is powerful. It closely resembles the fight flight response and is therefore profoundly affected by stress.
It's interesting. The Veterans Administration did a survey, and asked their employees about workplace aggression, and 67% of them reported that being treated in a rude or disrespectful manner was what they experienced. And so when we think about how we can contribute to organizational trust and just bringing down that those experiences of injustice, really thinking about that interactional, interpersonal justice is where where we need to focus. So we will talk more in future episodes about how we bring trauma-informed practice to life. Um, Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to create a healthy society and how we use our model, Creating Presence, to help do that. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. Thanks so much. See you next week.